Okay, it seems that everything is working, hopefully. Again, if you experience any kind of issue in the audio, please tell me. Let's finish this theoretical part about promises, and then we will continue the exercise that Professor De Russi started last week, I think, about the question and answer forum. We will see how far we will be able to go. Okay, so async await. I hope that promises are more or less clear for every one of you. Is there any question that you would like to ask before going on about promises? Okay. Was I very boring or was I very effective? No one would answer, okay. I think the first one. Okay, I'll try to do my best in this other hour. Okay, so if you get the main concept of promises, let's move on async await. This construct, yeah, you are seeing, okay? This construct was introduced in ECMAScript version 8, so 2 years after promises, because developers start to understand that promises are nice, are very useful, but sometimes they create code not so easy to read, because you start concatenating many different pieces of code, and it could be not so easy, especially for a novice developer, to understand how to read them, how to manage them. So they think, okay, how we can simplify this kind of construct, which is obviously very useful and we need it. So they introduced these two keywords, which are async and await. When you find a function with async in front of it, that means, as you can imagine, that that function is asynchronous. So in a certain point in time, that function will return a promise, because we already say that we manage a synchronicity with this object. And if you want to wait for a promise, you can put the keyword await in front of the asynchronous function. As I probably told, but if not, is something which is implicit, async await are something like overlapping promises, so they can be used together. For instance, here you have this function in the bottom of this slide, in which you are defining an asynchronous arrow function that just returns a string. And then here you call the function and you put .then and you do something, because async implicitly return a promise. This return test is basically equivalent to write resolve test. You are simply saying, okay, when the promise is fulfilled, return this value. So you probably start already to see the simplicity, because you don't need to remember that you are managing promises. That could be even something dangerous, because sometimes you do not do what you are doing, but it simplifies your life, basically. Is the result okay? And this piece, as you can imagine, this code is stopped until the promise is resolved or rejected. So let's start from async functions. They, as I already said, they define an asynchronous function when you see async, and obviously they operate in a separate order than the rest of the code, because they are asynchronous. I don't want to go in the detail of the even loop, and I mean, it's not so important to understand how they are implemented, but basically they, as I already said they return an implicit promise as their result. But you see that the code is more similar to traditional code, so it's easy to read, it's easiest to understand. On the other side, the await operator can be used to wait for a promise. And this is something that the first times that you work with this kind of function, you will say, that's strange, because you will see that these keywords are sometimes used in a strange way, but you must use await only inside a sync function. For instance, in the main source code of your application, you cannot write await an asynchronous function, because it has to be inside an asynchronous function. We will see an example later on. Okay, as you can imagine, await blocks the code execution until the promise is resolved. And when resumed, the value of the await expression is the fulfilled promise. Otherwise, do you hear, right? Okay. I'm afraid that you could lose the recording, but if you lose the sound, please tell to me. As I was saying, if the promise is rejected, the await expression throws the received value. So you have to manage it in a slight different way that we saw before. Okay, as it was written in the bottom of the slide, if the value of the expression following the await operator is not a promise is converted to a resolved promise. So this is again something very strange. You can write await, I don't know, 2 + 2, and that expression was converted to a resolved promise. So it's something strange, but I mean, I did not develop JavaScript. Okay, that's an example of something that we saw before. We have this resolve after 2-second function that return a new promise. This promise has a set timeout. I mean, the callback function of the promise has a set timeout that after the elapsed time is resolved, giving back this string. Okay, so here we have a traditional promise, as we said before, a classic function that return a promise. On the other side, instead of writing something like resolve after 2 seconds, dot then something, dot catch something, we just write await, resolve after 2 seconds, result, and then we manage the result. I think that you are, do you have a question? No, okay. It seems that someone raised his hand, okay. So you start seeing how simpler is the code written in this way. I mean, it seems like plain code, but as I already told you a few moments ago, you see this resolve after 2 seconds with the await in front was not written directly in the main code, because you have to wrap this keyword with async. That is something that I saw you, okay, in the beginning it's strange. So this is just because JavaScript was originally designed to be sequential. So you have to inform the developer in a certain way, or the browser, that inside this function there is an operation that is not deterministic. Because when you are waiting for something, you can wait for seconds, for minutes, for hours. I did not mention that before, but just to give you an idea, in the set timeout, the maximum allowed value is something around 24 days. So theoretically, you can await for an event for 24 days. I don't know who keeps for 24 days in a row open a browser page, but you can do it if you want. So here you are informing the browser, the user, beware, if you call this function, inside there is a piece of code that is not deterministic, that is asynchronous, that in a certain moment will do something. And that's the reason why you cannot use await outside the body of an asynchronous function. So okay, this method return a promise, this method look like sequential code, and async is used. Here you have an example of what you will see in the console. Okay, so here the program is started, the function are defined. We are calling the async call print console.log calling, and after a couple of seconds, you will see console.log result. That's the point. When you use async, okay, we said before that when we use async, we have a promise which is returned as the result of the function. So here, that async call return basically a fulfilled empty promise. Okay, so if we want, we can add a .then here and manage the return value. So as you can imagine, in this case, we did not write it because nothing is returned. So it is useless to have this keyword. But for instance, in this case, we have this return end, which is equivalent to resolve end, is basically the same statement. And then the caller manage that return value. So in this case, we have calling and end. Everything clear until this moment? Okay. I didn't hear you, sorry. Okay. The set time, okay, so if I correctly understand your question, are you asking me, is the set timeout works in the same way? As a wait? Yeah, basically that's the point. You will have a value that is returned, and then it's managed by who called the set timeout. Okay. Any other doubts about that? I know that. I don't know if. I mean, it's a little bit tricky, all this asynchronous part, but I hope that more or less you are on the point. Okay.
Since we have some asynchronous functions, is it possible that some of them, if we have, for example, a program that has a lot of asynchronous functions to call, is it possible that some of them never get called because of the fact that, I don't know, the event scheduler never came to this?
Okay, so I always repeat the question for the video recording. So are you saying to me, if we have many asynchronous functions, it could happen that I would say the scheduler, but the browser works in a different way, that the scheduler never call one of these functions. That's the point. No, theoretically, I mean, I'm not a browser developer, so I'm not 100% sure, but theoretically, it should arrive a moment in which these asynchronous functions are managed, especially if you are using a wait to wait for them. So because a wait forces the program to say, okay, here I really need this value, so please give it to me. Okay. So here you have an example of a code that is translated from promises to async await. So here, for instance, we have a request. We are collecting some API data, and when the data are ready, we print them on the screen. On the right side, we just say, okay, this is a synchronous function, console.log. I'm waiting for this data, and when it's done, return done. Okay, you see the code usually is smaller, the code usually is easy to read. So we have a lot of advantages in using async await instead of using promises. But if we come to you showing directly, okay, this is an async method without explaining to you the promise that are, hidden by this mechanism, it is difficult to you to understand what is going on. Here we have almost the same example that I showed you before, the one with get repository information. So we are getting the repository information, and we are defining this get issue method that, when it's resolved, allow us to discover the owner, and then allows us to send an email to the owner. And while obviously we are assuming that all these three functions return a promise, and on the bottom of the slide we have the same piece of code implemented with asynchronous with async await construct. And you can also notice how easier to understand what is returned but every function. This is also more easy to maintain, because, for instance, in this case, we are this get issue there, and you could say to you, okay, but this get issue, what is returning this get issue? What is the content that is here but is on the same line of the get owner? So if you are very tired in the end of a day in which you are programming JavaScript all day, this kind of approach is much more prone to give you errors, while here is very easy to understand the data that are there, because you have a wait get issue, here you have the issue, then you do get owner, issue.owner ID, and you get the owner. I mean, I think that you agree with me that the code on the bottom is easier to read, right? Okay. And that's basically what I already said to you. Obviously, beware that debugger would not stop on asynchronous code. So you would see that, again, I'm not 100% sure, but basically, for instance, when you are calling this function, you are putting the value of this callback function in response, and that's basically answer to your question that you asked before. In the moment in which we need to have access to response, you are sure that the callback is executed. For instance, here you have response.json, so these force the program to say, okay, I need this value, so I need to wait the result of this operation. But if, for instance, this is not possible because all the function use the results of the previous one, but let's suppose that this response is then used there, there is the possibility that until the execution reach that line, this callback is not executed because the program don't need that value. So in this moment it seems that I'm push you in use only async await, like, okay, don't use promise async await, or like, I don't know, the panacea or something that solve all the issues. But in the end, we can use both, because they can be used together. The other one, we just try to summarize some of them to give you some example. For instance, if the output of function 2 is dependent on the output of function 1, use await, which is basically the situation that we saw before. Otherwise, if two functions can be run in parallel, that is something, if you spot some function that can be run in parallel, do it. Maybe it's better to create two different async function and then collect them using promises.all, because you can wait for the completion of all of them. And again, instead of creating huge async function with many await async function in it, it is better to create smaller async function, because it's important to have not too much blocking code. This is not something strictly related to async await, so I don't know exactly why it's in this slide, but this is another point that is important to stress, that when you can split an asynchronous operation in many asynchronous operations, is always a very good idea to do that. And obviously, if your code contains blocking code, it is better to... Okay, are you still hearing? Okay. It is better to make it in an asynchronous function, so the caller can decide on the level of asynchronicity they want, basically. So, are you hearing this background noise? Okay, the battery seems good. Let's hope that this does not compromise the lecture. Okay. Here we have the example that we saw before, the one that lead us to the callback hell, basically. and one of your colleagues asked me about that during the break. Here you can see that we remanaged the code using promises, and this is the reason why I did not show you the example that I mentioned you before, which used an old way to manage the callback L, which is full anymore, considering that we have kind of stuff now. So basically, on the left side, you have this database.run insert into numbers, so the method that insert a value inside the database. On the right side, you have the method that count how many rows we have. So you see the methods are almost identical to the one that we saw before. The only big difference is that they are inserted in a promise that could be resolved in case everything is okay, or rejected on the other side. And as an example, we decide to use await instead. Remember, you can write, as I told you before, insert one dot then manage the promise in case everything is okay, dot catch manage the promise in case something goes wrong. This is probably something simple, because you just write await, insert, and then await, print count, and then you are sure that in this moment the program was stopped until the insertion is completed, and then the program is stopped until the counting is completed, and so you don't go anymore in that strange behavior in which you have sparse numbers. As I already told you before, you cannot write, you cannot delete the first line and just write in the main program the for and await, insert one, await, print count, because to use await, you need to be inside an asynchronous function. So this is a very common trick to do so. You write a main, and then you put the asynchronous function inside the main, which becomes an asynchronous function. Okay, let's see this situation, just to think you about the way in which the code is run. From your point of view, which of these two programs is the correct one? I'm just spoiling you that one of these two is not working properly, but let's try to discuss it about why. Any ideas? Feel free to speak. Is the correct one or the wrong one? Okay, and why do you think that the first one is correct? Okay, I repeat louder for everyone. He basically said, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you put the db.close inside the asynchronous main function, you are sure that this operation is executed after the for, while if you choose the right approach, you don't know when the database is closed. That's right? Does everyone agree with him, or is there any one of you that think that the second one is correct? No one? Everyone for the first one? Okay, apparently you have a big consensus. You can think about political election or stuff like that. Okay, so that's the point. Think also that it depends by, I would say, the scheduler, but it's not a scheduler, but just to say on the point that it could even happen that you close the database even before reaching the for. So it could happen that when you try to do the first insert one, the database was already closed and the program crashed, or probably not crash, but does not work as expected. Okay, so we are very close to the end. So all this stuff. Okay, tell me. But do you can put await before main? if you are in the main code, I mean, if this is your JavaScript source code with, I don't know, use strict here on the top, can you put await before main? Why? Not the point, because I told you before that you cannot use await if you are not inside an asynchronous function. Okay, so you need an extra wrapping function. So you should write, I don't know, this part of code should be inside my main function, and then you can async my main function, and then you can write await main. But yeah, in that case, it's right. Do you have another question?
Yes. For the promises, do we always need to implement both resolve and rejected parameters, or we can omit, for example, the rejected one, and we only want to precise what to do when we resolve the...
Okay, so your question is, are we forced to implement both resolve and reject? Okay, theoretically, no. It should work even if you do not implement both of them. But obviously, it strongly suggests to do so, because when you have a promise, you expect to have a resolved situation and a reject situation, so it's much better to define the correct behavior. Okay? Do you have a question? No? Okay. Okay, that's it. Can we go on? Okay, we are close to the end. So basically, we can say that this very long discussion right now is to understand how we can use the database, because the day after tomorrow we will have a laboratory on using database, and there are, I told you before that we decide to use SQLite for the course, and here you can see a list of libraries that you can use to manage it. We are going to use the SQLite 3 library that you can think, okay, it's like version 3 while this is version 1. No, it's not. Basically, the second one is a wrapper of the first one. SQLite 3 is the basic SQLite library, is basically a JavaScript wrapper of a C library that manages databases. And we decided to suggest you to use this one because we will explicitly need to manage promises, and we wanted you learn how to manage promises. While the second one is basically a wrapper of the first one that automatically manage promises, which is okay, good. So probably you will use it in the future, but right now let's focus on the first one. Then we have this asynchronous that is promise-based interface. Honestly, I don't remember exactly how does it work, but they said it is a great library. And then we have this very auto-celebrative library, which is called Better SQLite 3, that they say it's the faster and asynchronous library to manage SQLite. I don't know, probably they're right. I never did a test on that, but I mean, that's it. We finished the theoretical part. So let's try now to, okay, recording is still working. Let's now try to go on our exercise. I hope that I'm in the right point. It will be very difficult to develop something, but I will try to do my best. Okay. Let's see. Let's start from here. We have the example. Here we have the example that I mentioned you before, which is the strange one that managed the callback hell without using async await. I will upload later so you can have a look to it, but I mean, it's nothing particularly useful for you. It's just if you are very curious of how crazy were developers a few years ago. This is the example that I showed you before. Okay, let's move to questions. Okay. Very easy. Okay. So we continue what we see before in what you saw with Professor De Russis in the last lecture. Now we are starting with experimenting with a database. So this example will be very close to what you have to do on Thursday with a film library. So we are going to update the Q&A exercise to use the database. We manage a list of objects that include information about question, answer, and stuff like that. We already prepared the database, obviously, to save a bit of time. Maybe I can show you the data directly inside the database. Does it work? No, this is still the exam. Okay. Am I just probably saturating my RAM? Okay. Okay. Probably not so easy to you to spot. So, I mean, maybe it's better here. So we have the question. The question have the text, the author, the posting date, and we add an ID, because if you know database, you know that usually database tables have ID to identify object. Then we have the answer table, which have the answer text, the ID again, the response, the author name, the posting date, the score. And we have a list of methods that we have to implement. I'll try to go step by step. So basically, as Professor Corno suggests, we would implement the method in this order. So we start from get question, then adding a question, and then we see probably we try to develop also get answer and stuff like that. But I would like to start from the very beginning. So considering that is probably your first, second application, let's see how. Okay, so we are here. We have the database here, and I start to create this simple piece of code. Okay, let's change the directory. We are in questions. Okay, so just to don't copy and paste stuff, okay? When you are starting developing an application with Node, you will need several packages. So first of all, you need to initialize your repository. So you can do it with npm init, and it will help you in developing your app. So we will call this app week 03. The version is fine. Description. This is the first exercise about async callbacks. QA.js is fine. We do not want to have a test comp. We do not want to have git. No keywords. The author is me. The license is okay. This is an open source permissive license, so you can have a look if everything is fine. And we can say, yes, everything is fine. It also understands yeah, because it's very smart. So now you see that we created this package.json with the information that we entered right now. But then we have to include some libraries, because as I told you, we start to manage databases. So what is the next command that I should enter? Yes, so let's write npm e, that's I, that means install SQLite 3. And hopefully, if Politecnico's internet connection works, we will have the library in a couple of minutes. And then probably, do we need something more or not? JS. It's perfectly reasonable that we work with dates. So let's install also the JS. Again, probably this is the last time that we go so deeper in the details, but you will see that the package.json includes these dependencies part in which you can see the libraries with the current version, because we do not set any version number. We can also do that if we want. And we have also this package.lock that basically explain to the project which are the included library with additional details. For instance, all this stuff is needed by SQLite 3. So we are including this module, this module, this module, this module, and so on. Well, probably last time with DJS you have just one entry, I guess, because DJS is very small and do not need different dependencies. So let's move back here. We import the DJS library with the require instruction, which is an old way to import library that is used by Node. So when we start developing in the front end, we will use import, but on the back end, we need to use require. Then here, I just copied the statement that we saw in the slide about creating the database. The database is called question.SQLite, is here. So we will import them. Beware that this is a very common issue. I can show you in a moment. Just scroll the code. We have defined an object for the answer with the values. So we have, as I told you before, ID, text, author, score, date, and so more. And we have the question, which will be, the main object. Indeed, we plan to have a question list that I would like to call Q list instead of QL, because it seems Q1 and it's a bit disturbing for me. There is also this debugger instruction. I don't know if they explain you the role of this instruction, but when you try to debug some code in JavaScript, it could happen that the code is executed and you don't see anything on the screen. When you put the debugger instruction, the debug is stopped there, so you have the whole time to see what's happened to your program, to the variables and stuff like that. So probably, if now I execute, let's just add a console.log just to, very annoying. Let's just write console.log with question list created. Let's add the semicolon, save, and run node qa.js. Okay, question list created. So it seems that everything worked properly. But probably if I go in the run and debug part and start my debugger with Node, obviously, okay, no, probably because I already modified the file. Because what could happen is that if you have open your application in a higher folder, it could happen that for Visual Studio, for the debugger of Visual Studio Code, the path is different and is not able to find the database because it thinks to be one folder before or stuff like that. It's an issue that you could experience quite often. So I would like to show you the issues, but apparently today my PC tried to save my life and not show you any of what could go wrong. Okay. So let's start from, let me have a look to the text. Let's start from the get question, I guess. Okay. So basically, as you could expect, the get question retrieve a question given its ID. So very, very simple. So let's define a method, get question. And considering that maybe we could be interested in using this keyword of db.sql instead of using arrow function, let's define a traditional function. And let's suppose that the user would give us the ID of the question that he wants to get. So what we should, from what we could start, from the SQL query. What kind of query do you expect to have? The table is called question. After? No, I miss it. Thank you. Obviously, you have to put the point. That's the reason why it was red. Thank you very much. How do you query a table? How do you get the information from a table? Okay, are you already discussing the method of just focus on the query just to start? Are you saying select all? All from questions where ID is equal 20? Huh? To ID, okay. I heard 20. I said, what, 20? Okay, so let's write this query, very easy. So select all from question where my keyboard is almost broken, so probably I will do a lot of typing error. If you spot them, tell to me, okay? To see when the query is executed, for instance, we can print something on the console, like, I don't know what is happening, okay. Very easy to program in this way, I have to say. Okay, console.log, preparing for the query. Yeah. I misspelled a lot of characters, but okay. So this is something that I suggest you to do in the beginning. Use a lot of debug statements so you can spot where your code is. Okay, so then we need, obviously, as your colleague was saying before, to interact with the database, which is called DB. And for instance, we will have one single instruction here, because if we are querying for ID, we had just a line, right? Do you agree with that? So do you remember which is the method that we could use for it? Exactly. That get only the first row of the result. So let's try to write it. So db.get. We put here the SQL statement. We will have the ID given as parameter. Here, remember, even if we have a single query parameter, you need to give to the function an array, and then again the error and the row. And let's write something like if error. I will say to you that we are managing a database, so we are not aware of how much time do we need to get the data. So we need to use promise. Okay. So in case there is an error, we reject the promise, not reject. No, I don't want to use this. Reject error. Otherwise, we solve row. Okay. Obviously, we have to specify that we are returning a promise. So our method, now I hope that I don't break everything. So this method return a new promise with, as I told you before, resolve and reject. And that's the code. This stuff needs to be indented. Okay, then I have to close the parentheses, the semicolon. That's it. Maybe there is an extra parenthesis. This is closing that. This is closing that. This is closing the get question. What is the purpose of this? Ah, to close the question list. Okay. 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 Everything should work. Let's try. Another suggestion, do not wait too much time to test your code. So let's create a Q1 that use QList.getQuestion. And let's try to ask for question 1, for instance. Then console.log. The first question is, and let's print Q1. Okay, hopefully everything should work. Not at all, because why this code is wrong? Why is this code wrong? I heard something, but I did not get it. What am I returning here?
We didn't use the response of the promise.
Yeah, I mean, we want to use it because I write in this way. Okay, so we expect to have something inside Q1, right, which is the promise, basically.
Yeah, but we have to manage the two cases. If we resolve, if we reject the...
Exactly. And we have two different ways to do that. So we can use the async await, or we can just use then catch. So let's try to write .then. And now let's try to use async await, which is simpler. So just const q1 equal await and the result of the function. But in this case, we have another issue that we discussed before. Yeah, I'm not inside an asynchronous function. So a good approach could be to define async main with these lines. And then I will just call the main function. What did I do wrong? Thank you very much. Awesome. Okay, let's see. Okay. So apparently we have the question list created, which is something that we print after the creation of the question list. We have this debug function that is saying, I'm preparing for the query, so you know that this method is called. And then we observe that the query is successfully managed, and so we have the first question is Q1. So awesome, everything is working. Let's now move on the other method, which was add a question. So let's assume now that a user wants to add a new question, and we want to store it on the database. We already have the question object here with these values. So okay, so go inside the question list and add this function. I'm inside, yes. So this dot add question, again function add question, and here what do you suppose to give to this function as parameter? String, object, what? Just a string? Do you imagine? So do you imagine to give the text string to the object, right? And then creating to the object, sorry, to the function, then build the object there. But in this way, you need to pass different strings, right? Because you have the text of the question, the author, the date. So it could be an approach, but you need different strings. So what I suggest to you when you develop programs like that is to divide the object creation from the interaction with the database. So when you are developing a method that interact with the database, try to give to that method everything that he already need to work with the object. But obviously, this is just a suggestion. Everything is perfectly fine. So let's suppose that we want to give to this object, to this function again. I mean, it's true because functions in JavaScript are objects, but that's not what I mean. So let's assume that we want to assign, to give an object to that function. So let's create a question here. So let's define question. So it is, I lose my pointer, okay. It is an object, so new, like in other programming, object-oriented programming language. Then in this case, just because it's a simple program, we manually assign the ID to the question. Theoretically, a well-designed database should automatically manage the ID, or otherwise you can also query the database, obtaining the last ID, incrementing it by 1, and put it in the query. It depends of the implementation. Let's suppose to work in this, I would say, dumb way. So let's see inside the database. Actually, we have two questions that are the two questions that Professor De Russis implemented last week. So let's suppose to add question number 3, which is, I don't know, how to successfully pass Web App 1. And let's suppose that this question was written by me a couple of years ago, I don't know. So let's assume, I don't know, 2018 on May 13. Okay. Now we have the object, and we should insert the object inside the database. So let's assume to have QList dot add question, which is the method that we were implementing before. And we are going to pass the question. So for stuff that we can do, we are inside this method. We have this parameter. This is obviously very, a very step-by-step approach. But for instance, we can test, okay, we have created the object correctly. Does the, usually when you talk about method that interacts with database, you're talking about DAO methods, which mean direct access object method. So let's assume that we want to know if the DAO is receiving the correct object. So let's print the question, something like the received question is. And let's see if we are doing good. Okay, the received question is, this is the question object, the ID, the text, the author, and the date in the AJS format. I know that you already discussed how strange is the AJS to start with month with 0, so I don't want to go on this point. I'll comment this instruction because we probably don't need it anymore. And then, which kind of method could we use to, first of all, what is the SQL query that we need this time? What? Yeah, the method, but let's move a step back to the SQL method, because before you told me that you did SQL, you did SQL curses, so update, insert. What do you think, insert or update? Insert, okay, because we are creating a new entry inside the database. So let's insert into the question table a set of values. And we are going to parameterize these values. Again, as I told you before, always use parameters, never hard code stuff. Okay, then we have to choose the proper database method, SQLite method, and I have some hints from you before. What do you think that is the right method to execute this? Run. Okay. So let's write run SQL, which is the query that we created so far. Here we have to give the array. So we would not give directly the object. Unfortunately, the method does not manage the objects. So we have to write something like question.id, question.text. I'm going by memory. So we have ID, text, author, and date. Okay. So question.text, question.author, and the last was the date. Okay. Question.date. So we have a day.js object, right? So if I enter question.date, I would enter a strange object inside my database. Do you agree with that? What do you think is the best way to insert the date in the database? I lose a piece. You say day.js and then?
day.js, then we open the parentheses.
Mm-hmm.
We write question.date,
Uh-huh.
and after close the parentheses, and then dot format, and we insert the format.
Okay.
So we
That could be a good idea, but basically you are recreating something that you already have, right? Because your idea is I recreate a day.js object, and then I'm formatting it to the way that I need. So probably here is one of the moments in which we could have a look to the documentation. Again, I would like to do it with you because it's something that you will have to learn to do, even if it's quite impossible for me to read. Okay. So let's go in day.js. Docs. This is something that you really have to do often in this course, because especially when we start working with React, it will be almost impossible to remember everything about the components. So you will need to continuously go inside the documentation and having a look what are the parameters of this object, this object. So it's important that you become used to do so. So I guess that we are in, I would say, display part. So probably we can find something here. Okay, we have the format. So you are talking about creating a new object, but probably we could use .format even on an old object. We don't need probably to recreate the object from scratch. So that could be a good way to proceed. But there is this method that is interesting that is said as ISO 8601 string, which is basically the standard to formatting string, which is compliant to ISO. So you see, using format was a very good idea, but probably browsing the documentation, we could find something that is more standard, more suitable. So it's always a good idea to have a look to it. So I suggest to take this method and come back here. So question.date is a day.js object. Let's add this to ISO string, and let's hope that everything works as expected. So here we are running the query. And what did I forget? It is the same issue of before. The promise, yeah. let's write return new promise, resolve, reject. Okay, I have to move the parentheses there. Then let's open. The arrow is there. Okay. Okay. So at this point, we have the method. We had insert the question in the database. A good idea could be to try to fetch that object from the database and observe if we developed everything correctly. So let's call this object Q3. As you see here, we have a red arrow. Okay. Here we have two different issues, theoretically. Which are they? What is the issue in writing const Q1 again? Can you repeat louder? That's one, because we are defining a constant, and obviously you cannot reassign a constant. As you probably already know, if that constant is an object, you can manipulate the elements inside the object, but you cannot reassign the whole object. And what's the other issue that is the more evident, maybe? You cannot define two variables with the same name. Okay, so just to see if you are awake. So let's define this Q3 because it's the question with ID 3. And let's write the third question is. Okay. So let's try this time to run with the debugger so I can show you also the behavior. I have to change the console. As you can see, we are stuck here in the debugger. So here we still have the whole, I don't know why I could not move. Okay, but here you see we have the whole list with the question list, the this object, the SQLite library. I mean, we have all the objects that we defined. And okay, here we have a strange behavior. So probably, you see, we have question list created, preparing for the query, but probably the debugger was not able to find the database because we are not in the right folder that he's expecting. So at least I was able to show you the issue. So I can suppose that for the debugger we are one folder before, one folder up. So probably if here I add the folder name, which is questions, yeah. If here, where is the point? There, okay. If here I write question slash, probably, hopefully, now it should work. No, it doesn't like me. Okay, this is an issue that we should investigate more. So we do not have too much time, but I would just like to show you that this kind of issue could happen. So beware on where you put your file and where you launch your command. So let's go back to the normal console and let's execute. Yeah, I restore the previous name. And let's launch again QA. Okay, that's it. So preparing for the query, the third question is, and some days probably someone will reply to me how I have to do to pass web app. We can also have a look to the database to be sure that we have the question. As you can see now, there are only 2 questions. This is because we do not refresh the database yet. There is the refresh button here, and magically, here it is, the 3rd query. Then considering that we do not have too much time, we could try to investigate the question of one of your colleagues before. I don't remember, maybe it was you. Let's try to give different names to these variables to see if everything works. So for instance, we can call...
It's written in the documentation that
You can? Okay. So.
Maybe the order is important.
Okay, so let's try if everything works as expected. So put, I don't know, resem reg, just to show if the documentation say the truth. Let's try to add a 4th question. That could be, I don't know, does JS documentation say the truth? And again, this is asked by me, but today, which is the 14th of March. And here we could write the 4th question is. So let's stop the debugger. Okay, apparently everything goes smoothly. And here it is. So yes, the JavaScript documentation say the truth. And we discover that we can call this parameter as we want, but try to be compliant with the standard. Okay. Maybe we have time for one more operation. We did the question list dot add, question dot get answer, question dot add, question dot get top. Okay. So basically, the method to add an answer makes sense. Okay. Let's try to add an answer for that. So let's copy the constructor. So let's create this A1, which is a new answer. I don't remember, last ID of answer was 4. So this will be the answer 5. Let's suppose to answer to this last question. So the answer would be yes. The doc was right. The author is a JS developer, unknown. And then let's assume that these have a score of 15, 150. And it was, considering that the question was from today, obviously we have to put at least a day of today. Does not have sense to that the answer was in the past. Okay. Then assume to have a method that allow us to add the answer A1. And as before, we could, let's follow the same approach of before. Let's call this object answer. We don't need yet the method to fetch the answer. Okay, we will see it just in the database. So we are creating the answer, and we are going to add the answer to the database. So let's go here. So again, we have a function add answer that receive the answer. Again, which kind of SQL query do you expect to use? Very easy. Come on. It's a few lines on top. The same for the question, you mean? But slightly modified because we are now interacting with the answer table, right? So basically, again, another insert. So let's try to copy that. So this time we are not inserting into question, but into answer. Let's see. Yes, the table is answer. And it has a question ID associated to have the link. I lose the pointer. Okay, so obviously the correct approach is to fetch. You have the answer, and you should have a link between the answer and the question. Here, we do not have anything like that in the object. So just to be fast, use the time, let's assume that we pass the question ID as parameter. So here, when we invoke this function, we are going to pass 4, which is the ID of this question. Or if you want to be more object-oriented, we could write something like who4.id, which is something that could make sense. So I'm querying for the question, and then when I have the ID, I'm querying for the associated answer. In this case, I'm inserting, not querying, but the concept is that. So in this case, we need, we can do it no, not a big deal. We can create it during the execution. So db.run, we are getting the SQL statement. Then we put the answer.id. Let's see the fields in the database. Answer.text. Answer.author. Where the hell is the pointer? Okay. Author, date, score, and the ID. So author. Date, which use again the toISO string. Answer dot score and the question ID. Okay. Everything should be fine. So again, what does it miss? Promise. Very good. This time you were faster. So. This will reject. Arrow function, open. Okay. Hopefully, everything should be okay. Considering that we do not have yet the method to retrieve the answer, we could at least observe if we are passing the right parameters here. So before invoking the promise, let's print the received answer is the answer, and print also the associated question ID is question ID. Okay, let's see if everything is working. What the hell is that? Okay, we did some mistake. SQLite constraint, unique constraint failed, question ID. That's strange. Maybe did I assign question ID 4 instead of 5? Yeah. Okay. No, 5. That's strange. So I'm adding an answer.id, .text, author, date, score, question ID. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parameters. Just 5 here, okay. That could be the issue. No. Unique straight failed question.id. Ah, because, yeah, that makes sense, because here there is a piece in which we are adding again a question that is already in the database. So let's comment this operation. Obviously, I was trying to recreate a question that was inside the database, and the database prevents me to do so. Okay. Here it is. Here we have the received answer. Yes, the doc was right. And here we have the associated question ID. We can also have a look in the database. And here is the 5th question, the 5th question. Okay. So our time is over. So You will continue this exercise next week with Professor De Russis, hopefully. And see you on Thursday for the next lab. Reasonably, you will have, by the end of today, the solution of the previous lab and the code that we developed in class so far. And by tomorrow, you will have the text of the Thursday laboratory. We will try to keep this schedule for the next week. So we will try to give you the solution of the previous lab on Tuesday and the text of the lab on Wednesday. We will try to do our best, but you know, we are 3 different courses managed in parallel, so it's not so easy to manage everything. But we will try to do that. So have a nice rest of the day and see you in the lab.